Over the centuries, warfare has seen some of the most brilliant strategies that changed the momentum of battles and the fate of many nations for centuries to come. When World War II began in 1939, Nazi Germany took everyone by surprise by its rapid advances through most of Europe. It started by attacking Poland in September 1939, and within just months, the Nazi forces had taken control of France. Germany occupied its European rivals through a war strategy that shocks one's mind even today when you read about it: Blitzkrieg. It included a combined military offensive by motorized infantry, tanks, artillery, and aircraft to overwhelm the enemy and quickly break through its defenses. Things were going well for Germany until the winters of 1941, and it seemed there would be no stopping the Nazis. But then an ingenious tactic by the Allied forces changed everything. The new strategy forced the Axis forces to go on the defensive and would eventually wreck Germany. So, what was this most genius tactic? Who came up with the idea, and how did it change the tides in the bloodiest war in history? Watch this video until the end to find answers to these questions and learn interesting details about the ending years of World War II. Blitzkrieg in English translates to lightning war, and Nazi forces certainly advanced through Europe at lightning speed from 1939 to 1941. This war strategy by Germany included a combined arms attack that took the enemy by surprise. From armored and motorized infantry formations to air assault, close air support, and artillery, Blitzkrieg included everything. This combined attack by Germans was intended to break through the enemy's lines of defense and make it difficult for the opponents to respond by constantly changing fronts. While the enemy thought of an effective strategy, they would be defeated in a decisive battle of annihilation, or Vernichtungsschlacht. Aircraft and tank technologies had matured between World War I and World War II. Germany combined these technologies with the systematic application of its traditional tactic of Bewegungskrieg, or maneuver warfare. Bewegungskrieg included bypassing the enemy's strongpoints and penetrating deep into their territory. The Nazi forces would eventually encircle the enemy forces and attack it from all sides until its military capabilities were completely destroyed, forcing the remaining enemy troops to surrender. Although the Western newspapers adopted the term Blitzkrieg during Germany's invasion of Poland, it had already appeared in the German military periodical Deutsche Wehr, or German defense, in connection to lightning warfare. Between 1939 and 1941, German tactical strategies proved highly effective, one reason why it occupied most of Europe so quickly. Blitzkrieg became a common term in Western media reports by 1940. Blitzkrieg was proving effective wherever German forces went, like the invasion of the Ardennes forest region. It also exposed the overall Allied unpreparedness and their failure to keep up with the pace of the German assault. When the Battle of France began, the French forces tried to reorganize their defensive positions along rivers, but before they could establish any defensive line, German forces were at their door earlier than they had expected. By 1941, Germany had overrun most of Europe. Such was the speed of German advance that after invading Poland in September 1939, the Nazis took only April and May of 1940 to defeat and occupy Denmark, Norway, Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, and France. In the first half of 1941, Yugoslavia and Greece also came under Germany's control. It is likely that Germany would have defeated and occupied Great Britain too, had it not been for the English Channel and the Royal Navy that prevented attacks from German ground troops. The Soviet Union was a great military power and bordered with Nazi Germany, its allies, and the countries under its occupation. Germany didn't have to worry about the USSR because of the good relations it had enjoyed with the Socialist Republic country. On August 23, 1939, Germany and the Soviet Union came to an agreement in Moscow known as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a non-aggression pact. Not only this, but the two countries also included a secret protocol in the pact that detailed a plan for dividing Eastern European countries among them. According to the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, if Germany invaded Poland, it would be divided between Germany and the USSR, and the Soviet Union would be allowed to take over Finland, Estonia, Latvia, and the area of Bessarabia. The rest of the world knew about the non-aggression pact between the two countries, but was unaware of the details regarding Poland's division. However, it was a surprising development for countries around the globe, considering the conflicting ideologies and earlier animosity. Just a week after signing the non-aggression pact with the USSR, Germany attacked Poland, which marked the beginning of World War II. While the Nazi forces advanced through Europe, the relations between Germany and the Soviet Union flourished. They had strong diplomatic relations and increased their economic partnership in different areas. The two countries even signed a trade agreement in 1940, the German-Soviet Commercial Agreement, by which Germany would provide the USSR with military equipment and trade goods in return for raw materials like oil and wheat, which was an effort to bypass the British blockade of Germany. However, despite what appeared to be a strong bond in public, both Germany and the Soviet Union were suspicious of the other's motives. For example, when the USSR invaded Bukovina in June 1940, it exceeded their agreed-upon sphere of influence with Germany. Following Germany's alliance with Italy and Japan, discussions began on the possibility of the USSR joining the Axis powers. After 2 days of talks in Berlin in November 1940, a treaty was proposed by Ribbentrop that would see the Soviet Union joining the Axis powers. However, Hitler did not want to add the Soviets to the Axis. An order issued by him stated, "Political conversations designed to clarify the attitude of Russia in the immediate future have been started. Regardless of the outcome of these conversations, all preparations for the East previously ordered orally are to be continued. Written directives on that will follow as soon as the basic elements of the Army's plan for the operation have been submitted to me and approved by me." While Hitler was against the idea of letting the USSR too close to Germany, the Soviets approached the 1940 negotiations differently. The USSR showed its willingness to make significant economic concessions to Germany to secure a relationship that met the Germans' general terms in the commercial agreement just a year before. The USSR even proposed a written counteroffer to join the Axis bloc. The only condition was Germany's promise that it would not interfere in the Soviet Union's sphere of influence. However, Germany did not respond to this proposal. As occasional collisions between Germany and the USSR began in Eastern Europe, the likelihood of a full-scale conflict between the two countries increased. But despite this, they signed an agreement in 1941 that addressed several unresolved issues between them. Joseph Stalin was confident in the USSR's military strength and believed his country would emerge victorious in case of a German attack. He also assumed that since the Nazi forces were fighting with Great Britain on the Western Front, Hitler would not risk starting a war on two fronts simultaneously. This assumption led to the delay in the reconstruction of defensive fortifications along the Soviet border. But Stalin was proved wrong when Germany launched a sudden attack on the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941. Germany's Blitzkrieg strategy took the Soviets by a complete surprise. Moscow did not fully comprehend the scale of the disaster facing the Soviet troops on the border, and Stalin's initial response was one of disbelief. It took several days for the Soviet leadership to fully realize the extent of their initial defeat at the hands of Germany. In December 1941, Japan attacked the United States, which prompted the US Congress to declare war on Japan. Since Japan was part of the Axis bloc, Germany responded by declaring war on the United States. Hitler had pledged to defend Japan in case of an attack by the United States. With Germany declaring war, the United States faced a two-ocean war against Germany in the Atlantic and against Japan in the Pacific. On the other hand, Germany was looking unstoppable with victory on every front that it opened. The Allies had to quickly come up with a strategy that could stop Hitler and put an end to a war that had already resulted in the death of millions of people. And just when they needed an ingenious strategy to counter Germany, they devised one: closing the ring. The closing the ring tactic involved engaging Germany on several fronts and gradually closing in on Berlin from all sides. While Japan posed a major threat in the Pacific, the Allies decided to focus on Germany first because defeating Germany would make the task of countering Japan easy. Winston Churchill, the British Prime Minister, was reluctant initially because closing the ring also included a cross-channel invasion of Nazi-occupied France from Britain. The British leadership feared that if such an attack failed, it would result in a huge loss of human life and military resources, and Great Britain would be at the mercy of German forces. But the Allied powers went ahead with the plan, knowing it was their best chance to stop Germany. While the US and UK finalized the closing the ring strategy, the USSR had stopped Germany, and the tide of Operation Barbarossa, the code name for Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union, was slowly turning. This meant the USSR, one of the major Allied powers, would eventually close the ring from the east, and the United States and Great Britain had to weaken Germany's position from the other three directions. As part of the closing the ring tactic, in December 1941, the United States and Great Britain decided to start their attacks on Germany from North Africa. The plan was executed in October 1942 with the Second Battle of El Alamein. The First Battle of El Alamein and the Battle of Alam el Halfa, fought in July and December 1942, had already prevented the Germans from advancing further in North Africa. After winning the Battle of Gazala from the 26th of May to the 21st of June 1942, the Panzer Army Africa, led by Lieutenant General Curie Barbasetti and under the strategic direction of General Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, who was also known as the Desert Fox, had pushed forward into Egypt. This force included both German and Italian tanks and infantry and posed a serious threat to the British control of the Suez Canal, the Middle East, and its important oil supplies. Great Britain had its 8th Army, which was under the tactical command of General Claude Auchinleck, to counter the Axis forces in North Africa. In July 1942, the 8th Army's attempts to counterattack were unsuccessful, as the Axis forces regrouped in North Africa. When Winston Churchill visited Cairo in August, he replaced General Claude Auchinleck with General Harold Alexander as Commander-in-Chief, Middle East Command. General William Gott was appointed to command the 8th Army, but was soon killed when the German fighter plane shot down his aircraft. Lieutenant General Bernard Montgomery was flown in from Britain to replace General Gott. Codenamed Operation Lightfoot, Montgomery devised a strategy involving 2 main assaults on the German and Italian troops, one to the north of the front line and another to the south, with the participation of the 30th and 13th Corps of the British Army. The 10th Corps, led by Lieutenant General Herbert Lumsden, was tasked with taking advantage of any successes. Although the Axis forces hadn't suffered heavy losses in their unsuccessful offensive at the Battle of Alam el Halfa, the failure forced them to switch to a defensive position. The Axis supply route from Tripoli was incredibly lengthy, and the captured British resources and gear were nearly depleted. But despite this, Rommel chose to push forward into Egypt. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel knew the British and Commonwealth troops would soon complete their reorganization and become strong enough to launch a counteroffensive. His sole hope now depended on the German forces in the Battle of Stalingrad to swiftly defeat the Red Army and proceed southward through the Trans-Caucasus region. If this strategy succeeded, a large number of Allied troops would need to be diverted from the Egyptian front to reinforce the 9th Army in Iran. This would result in the delay of any further offensive operations against the Axis forces. Rommel hoped to persuade Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, or OKW, the Supreme Military Command and Control Office of Germany during World War II, to strengthen his troops for the eventual link-up between Panzer Army Africa and the German forces engaged in southern Russia. This would enable the Germans to defeat the British and Commonwealth forces in North Africa and the Middle East. On October 23, 1942, Operation Lightfoot commenced with a massive artillery assault by the British forces. The strategy was meticulously planned, with the initial assault involving 1,000 guns from both field and medium batteries. Following a 20-minute initial wave of fire, the focus shifted to precise targets to support the advancing troops. The bombardment continued for 5.5 hours, during which time each weapon was estimated to have fired approximately 600 rounds, totaling around 529,000 shells. Initial aerial reconnaissance revealed that the Axis forces hadn't changed their positions much. This led to an order by General Montgomery to clear the northern route for the New Zealand Division, which was supported by the 10th Armoured Division, to advance south from Miteru Ridge. Meanwhile, the 9th Australian Division, positioned in the north, was tasked with planning a crumbling operation that night. In the southern sector, the 7th Armoured Division was to try and penetrate the minefields with support from the 44th Division if needed. However, just after sunrise, the 51st Highland Division was counterattacked by Panzer forces, which was ultimately stopped. By the 25th of October, the Commonwealth forces were positioned at the peak of Miteru Ridge in the southeast. As for the Axis forces, they were firmly established in most of their initial positions. Montgomery concluded that the planned push southward from Miteru Ridge by the New Zealanders would be too costly, so he opted for a different strategy. He decided that the 30th Corps, while maintaining control over Miteru Ridge, should move northward towards the coast with the 9th Australian Division. The 1st Armoured Division, on the Australian left, was to keep advancing west and northwest, and activity to the south on both fronts would be limited to reconnaissance. The fight would be focused on the kidney feature and Tel el Isa until a breakthrough was achieved. The main battle took place near Tel el Akakir and the kidney feature. A mile to the northwest of the feature was Outpost Woodcock, and about the same distance to the southwest was Outpost Snipe. A strategy was devised to assault these locations with 2 battalions from the 7th Motor Brigade. The Rifle Brigade was scheduled to assault Snipe, while the 2nd Battalion King's Royal Rifle Corps, or KRRC, was to assault Woodcock. The plan included the 2nd Armoured Brigade to encircle Woodcock from the north in the early hours of the 27th of October. The 24th Armoured Brigade was tasked with surrounding the Snipe outpost from the south with artillery support from the 10th and 30th Corps. The Battle of El Alamein continued for the next couple of weeks before the British and Commonwealth forces defeated the Axis forces in the second week of November 1942. Seeing a defeat, Rommel planned to engage in a delaying strategy at Sidi Barrani, located 80 miles to the west of Matruh, aiming to buy time for Axis forces to navigate through the bottlenecks at Halfaya and Sollum. However, by the morning of the 11th of November, the Allied forces captured the area, and the Egyptian front was clear by night of the same day. The Battle of El Alamein, the first major battle part of the Closing the Ring strategy, shifted the momentum in favor of the Allied forces that would see them victorious against the Axis powers in 1945. In 1950, looking back at the famous battle, Winston Churchill wrote, "It may almost be said, before Alamein, we never had a victory. After Alamein, we never had a defeat." The Nazi leadership was yet to comprehend the losses at the North African front when the USSR launched Operation Uranus to give an already exhausted Axis forces the final blow. The Wehrmacht began its summer offensive against the Soviets on the 28th of June 1942, which was codenamed Case Blue. In under a month, the German forces had captured the city of Rostov, and the next target was to simultaneously capture Stalingrad and the Caucasus oil fields. The Sixth Army was tasked with capturing Stalingrad, which swiftly moved towards the Volga River and began advancing to the city with support from Luftwaffe, the German Air Force. On the 7th of August, 2 German panzer corps successfully outflanked and surrounded a Soviet force of 50,000 soldiers and about 1,000 tanks. By the 22nd of August, German troops started to cross the Don River to finish their push towards the Volga. The next day, the Battle of Stalingrad began when the Sixth Army penetrated the city's suburbs. By November 1942, the Sixth Army had taken control of the majority of Stalingrad, forcing the Red Army to retreat along the banks of the Volga River. At this point, there were reports of a counterattack by the Soviets to force the German forces out of the city. However, the German military leaders didn't know exactly when and where the Soviet counteroffensive came from. On the 19th of November 1942, the Soviets launched Operation Uranus, the code name for their counteroffensive against the Axis forces in and around Stalingrad. At 7:20 a.m. Moscow time, the Soviet artillery began an assault on the Axis forces defending the German flanks. 10 minutes later, the Katyusha rocket launchers launched their first series of rockets, followed by 3,500 guns and mortars. The impact was severe as it disrupted communications, destroyed ammunition supplies, and damaged forward observation posts. The soldiers of the Romanian 4th Army Corps who survived the heavy bombardment began to retreat. The Soviet attacks on the Axis forces continued for the next 4 days, and the German 6th Army was completely encircled by the 23rd of November. The junction between the armored forces from the 21st and 51st Armies, led by Vatutin and Yeremenko, encircled 2 of the most formidable German armies, consisting of 22 divisions and 150 separate regiments or battalions, along with a vast amount of equipment. The battle continued into the next day as the Germans tried unsuccessfully to launch local attacks to escape the trap. By this point, Axis soldiers trapped inside the perimeter were moving east towards Stalingrad to avoid the USSR tanks, while those who managed to break through the encirclement started moving west where German and other Axis forces were stationed. Between 250,000 and 300,000 Axis troops were trapped as a result of Operation Uranus. The encircled pocket, which was roughly 50 kilometers long and 40 kilometers wide, contained 4 infantry corps, a panzer corps belonging to the 4th Panzer and 6th Armies, and surviving elements of 2 Romanian divisions, a Croatian infantry regiment, and other units. More than 100 tanks, 2,000 artillery pieces, and 10,000 trucks were also trapped in the pocket. Operation Uranus was the turning point of the war on the Eastern Front. The Axis forces that had taken the USSR and other allies by surprise by attacking the Soviets had been defeated, and the lost Battle of Stalingrad marked the start of retreat for the Axis forces. The ring had closed from the south and begun to close from the east after the USSR went on a counter-offensive. It was time to close it from the west and end a war that had caused severe losses on both sides since it began. To do that, the Allies launched one of the most ambitious missions in war history, Operation Overlord. The fall of France was declared the most famous victory in history by Adolf Hitler when the Nazi forces occupied the country in just a month. Operation Overlord referred to the Allied campaign that started from Normandy in France and initiated the victorious release of Western Europe from German control. The operation began on June 6, 1944, which is commonly known as D-Day, with the Allied landings in Normandy, France. Before the landings, a 1,200 plane airborne attack was carried out, followed by a sea-based invasion with over 5,000 vessels. The initial stage of the operation involved an amphibious attack on German positions. To secure the necessary air dominance for a successful invasion, the Allies initiated a tactical bombing operation. Codenamed Point Blank, these air-to-ground attacks targeted German aircraft production, fuel resources, and air bases. The infrastructure for communication and the road and rail connections were attacked to cut off northern France from the rest of the Nazi forces and make it difficult to bring up reinforcements. These operations were widespread to misguide the Germans about the exact location of Allied landings a few days later. The Normandy coastline was divided into 17 sectors, with each further subdivided into beaches. From April 1944 to D-Day, the Allied Expeditionary Air Force conducted more than 3,200 aerial reconnaissance missions. These missions captured detailed images of the French coast at very low altitudes, revealing the landscape, barriers on the beach, and defensive features established by the German troops, such as bunkers and artillery positions. These missions were carried out along the European coastline to conceal the location of the planned invasions from the Germans. Training exercises for the Overlord's amphibious operations began as early as July 1943. Since the nearby shoreline resembled Normandy, the coastal town of Slapton in Devon was evacuated in December 1943 and converted into a training ground for military exercises of the Allied forces. These exercises included the use of landing craft and handling of beach barriers. To protect against a presumed attack by the Allies, Hitler ordered the building of defenses along the Atlantic coast, stretching from Spain to Norway. He planned for 15,000 positions to be manned by 300,000 soldiers, but due to a lack of resources, especially concrete and manpower, only a fraction of these fortifications were completed. As the expected site of an Allied invasion, Pas-de-Calais was a heavily defended area by the Germans. In the Normandy region, the best defenses were located at the harbours of Cherbourg and Saint-Malo. By May 1944, 1.5 million American soldiers had reached the United Kingdom. The majority were accommodated in the makeshift camps in the southwest of England, prepared to be transported across the English Channel to the western part of the landing area. British and Canadian forces were stationed in more eastern locations, ranging from Southampton to New Haven. A sophisticated system known as movement control was devised to ensure that the soldiers and vehicles departed on time from 20 different departure sites. Finally, the day came when the Allied forces initiated the most important mission of World War II, which would prove to be the final nail in the coffin of German ambitions. The Allied soldiers and equipment started moving towards the planned landing sites. Omaha, the sector with the highest level of defense, was given to the US 1st Infantry Division, with additional forces from the US 29th Infantry Division. They were expecting light resistance from a single regiment of Wehrmacht, but instead encountered the 352nd Infantry Division. Strong tides pushed numerous landing boats east of where they were supposed to be or slowed them down. The number of casualties was greater than in all other landings combined because German troops were stationed in bunkers on the cliffs, and the Allied soldiers were in open and direct sight. The Allied forces were able to move past the coastline defensive lines of the Germans and push inwards. For the next couple of months, the fight continued on several fronts in France. On September 1st, 1944, Eisenhower assumed direct command of all Allied ground troops. Worried about a German counter-offensive and limited supplies reaching France, he chose to carry out operations across a wide area instead of trying to make narrow thrusts. The link-up between the Normandy troops and the Allied forces in southern France happened on September 12th as part of an effort to push towards the Siegfried Line. On September 17th, General Montgomery initiated Operation Market Garden, a failed effort by British-American airborne forces to seize bridges in the Netherlands, enabling ground troops to cross the Rhine into Germany. The Allied progress was slowed by German opposition and a shortage of supplies, particularly fuel. On December 16th, the Germans initiated the Ardennes Offensive, also known as the Battle of the Bulge. It was Germany's last major attack on the Western Front, but it was too late by then. On January 12th, the USSR began successful operations on the Eastern Front and started closing into Berlin. The Allied also moved from Western Europe to the German capital. As Soviet forces approached the Führer bunker in Berlin, the German defeat was in sight. On the 30th of April 1944, Hitler committed suicide, leading to Germany's surrender on May 7th. The establishment of a new front in Western Europe was a tremendous psychological setback for Germany's leadership, who feared a repetition of World War I by facing a two-front war. The invasion of Normandy was the biggest and most extensive amphibious operation in history. It involved nearly 5,000 landing ships, 289 warships to escort the landing ships, and 277 ships to clear mines. The closing the ring tactic that began in 1942 proved to be the most genius war strategy that completely wrecked Germany on all fronts. The Axis forces that were looking unstoppable in the initial years of the war were stopped in their advances and forced to retreat because of the closing the ring tactic.